variable length output arguments using varargout is a similar process, but there's a few differences since these are outputs as opposed to inputs. So let's go through that. Here's our example vol using varargout. Let's trace through what happens if this is called with 7 output arguments. Here's what the vol code should properly do. On entry, the function nargout will return the number 7. Indeed, this function was called with 7 output arguments. Based on this value of nargout, the code inside vol must do the following. It must allocate enough space for varargout. There are 3 standard output arguments, requiring that varargout be of dimension 1 by 4 to handle the total of 7. Next, the code should do whatever it's supposed to do when it's called with 7 output arguments and compute the first 3, A, B, and C, and then the next 4, constituting the total of 7. I've called output arguments 4, 5, 6, and 7 V1 through V4. Finally, it should assign to the contents of varargout the objects V1 through V4. The contents of varargout 1 should be V1, and so on to the contents of varargout 4. When this returns, back in the caller's workspace, the value of W is V1, the value of X is V2, Y V3, and Z V4. So with varargout, the program must allocate varargout to the proper dimension and then fill its contents with the appropriate values. We'll do an example of a variable length output argument list with a program called splita. Here's what the function does. It has 2 input arguments. The first is a 2-dimensional array of any class denoted by M, and the second is a positive integer, N. The behavior is the first output should be the column dimension of M divided by N and then rounded up if necessary. It's how many groups you would get splitting the columns of M into groups of N. The second output is the first N columns of M. The third output is the second N columns of M, and so on. The kth output is the k-1th group of N columns drawn from M, and so on until all the columns are used, and it's very possible that the last set will have less than N columns, somewhere between 1 and N. Clearly, this calls for a variable length output argument list, since there's no way to tell a priori how many outputs there be. It really depends on the column dimension of M and the positive integer N, which dictates how large the groups are. Let's go through the actual code for splita. The function declaration line uses the varargout keyword as a second output argument after the fixed output argument N groups. The size of M is calculated. The number of output arguments in varargout is nargout minus 1, accounting for the fixed output argument N groups. N groups is the number of groups that the columns of M will be divided into. Of course, if the caller requests too many output arguments, then there should be an error, as that would leave certain outputs unfilled. Assuming that's not the case, allocate the varargout cell array, be the proper dimension, and then begin filling it. The last output may be special, so handle that separately. For the other ones, simply loop over K, grabbing N columns at a time from M, and placing them in the contents of the varargout cell array. If the number of outputs equals the number of groups, exactly enough output arguments were used to account for all sections, then the contents of the last element of varargout are filled with the remaining columns of M. And if fewer outputs were requested, then it's really as though the loop continued, grabbing the next N columns of M, which may or may not be until the very end. And that's the code. Download the code from the class site and try this on a few examples. Here's an array with 8 columns. This command splits it into 4 groups of 2 columns each. This also splits it into 4 groups of 2 columns each, but only the first group is returned. Here, none of the groups are returned, only the number of groups, 4. This splits the columns into groups of 9, so there'll only be 1 group and in fact that first group will only have 8 columns in it, since that's all that M has in the first place is 8 columns. Attempting more than one group with 9 columns gets an error as expected.